Michael, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. We're going to ask you to make a few comments, opening remarks about our topic today, which is the Electoral College on this Election Day 2024, and then we'll go to questions.
All right. Kathy, thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you and your colleagues. I want to thank my friend Barbara Bowie Whitman for hosting us today. We're neighbors as you are, Kathy, here in Northern Virginia. And Angie Shippert, nice to meet you. We're fellow Illinoisans, and apparently you're on the Lee County Board of Supervisors. And of course, I used to be on the board not too far from you. And Jordan and Jewel, thank you as well. And Janine, nice to be with you. So I think the founders would say that the Electoral College is not a problem, but it became a solution to a problem. They were creating a government for the first time with a constitution, really in world history. They got the idea of writing a constitution really from the Ten Commandments. The idea that the story of writing the rules and being clear with people about what was right and wrong, what was the design of government was very important in biblical terms and to the founders. Jefferson once wrote, "We need to bind men down from their own nature by the chains of the Constitution." In Federalist 84, Hamilton writes, "This Constitution didn't need a Bill of Rights because the entire Constitution is a Bill of Rights." The whole idea was the checks and balances, the limited nature of the government power in what became Washington, D.C., would be such that there was nothing to fear, I guess you would say, even though the Anti-Federalists had a different view, which is they thought that the federal government would become far too powerful. Now, why was it a solution to a problem? In May of 1787, when the delegates from 12 of the 13 states arrived into Philadelphia, by the way, Rhode Island did not send any delegates, so much they feared that James Madison from Virginia and the Virginians, like George Washington, who's going to chair the convention, would take things over and create a constitution that would be for the large, powerful state of Virginia and others. Virginia had 750,000 people. Georgia had 75,000, 1/10. Delaware had about 60,000 people, and Rhode Island smaller than that. Virginia included the state of West Virginia at the time, and Massachusetts, which has Boston, also included the state of Maine. Later, Maine became its own state. New York City made the state of New York very populous, and the largest city in the country was Philadelphia, which meant Pennsylvania, rounded out the big four. So it was Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia had most of the people in America at the time. But the 9 states were very fearful that whatever would happen in this Constitutional Convention, the populous states would win out. Now, Angela and I grew up in Illinois and not in Chicago, and we're very happy to say that. I know growing up in Peoria, I didn't like the New York Yankees because they're always in the World Series, and I did not like Chicago because they controlled the state. And if you live in Albany, New York, you don't want really, you're not very happy maybe with New York City controlling so many things. So there's an aversion in the American mind toward the concentration of power to the big cities. So anyway, there were debates about a House and Senate, a court system, but they put off all summer, 116 days that they met, they put off deciding and agreeing on how to elect a president. The last week of the convention, they had a committee of 11 people, including James Wilson and Madison and a few others, Gouverneur Morris, who came up with the idea of an electoral college. And the idea was put to a debate and vote. And the first debate or vote was, should we have a national popular vote? And only one delegate voted for that, someone from Philadelphia voted for that. I believe it was James Wilson. because nobody wanted to have a national popular vote. It would always be a president from a highly populated state. Then they voted, well, should we have the Congress elect the president like they do in Great Britain, where the prime minister is elected? And they thought, we won't have an independent executive. We'll have the president or the prime minister here in America will do whatever the Congress wants. And there'd been a lot of problems with legislative tyranny in the 13 states because they had their own constitutions, very, very weak governors. Sometimes the governors were appointed by legislatures. Almost all the governors that were elected had one-year terms because they feared having a king. And therefore, they thought, we'll have a very weak president. And George Washington, who never said a word in the Constitutional Convention as chairman, in the meals that they had every day together, these 59 men, he would say things like, have you ever been on a ship in a storm without a captain? Because for 7 years, I led the Revolutionary War against the British, and I didn't have one captain, I had 13. The Articles of Confederation had 13 captains, and therefore I couldn't get anybody to agree on what I should be doing or who's going to pay for it. In other words, he found that the rule by committee was a disaster, especially in wartime or time of emergency. And he convinced them the third vote, which is let's have a popular vote by state, and then or by state legislature, and then we will aggregate the results. And so we weren't going to have the Congress elect the president. We weren't going to have a national popular vote. So the solution to this problem for electing the president was each state legislature or the people of those states would vote, and then we would aggregate those, just like the World Series, where we have 7 independent games. We aggregate them and we get the results. So this, for them, the Electoral College was a system where all the states would have democratic processes. They would aggregate the results, and it would be the will of the 13 states. And it's worked very well, not perfectly because nothing's perfect, but it's worked very well for the country. And therefore, we are served today, on election day, by the Electoral College system. So with that, maybe I should conclude my opening comments and see what people would like to discuss.
Well, thank you, Michael. That was a great overview. And I love your analogy to the World Series. And I had not heard that one before. And that's a great analogy. And I know we've got a lot of great questions lined up from our panel, so I'm going to turn it over to Jewel.
Our election process is fascinating because when you're little and you learn about the president, you kind of just learn and think that whoever everybody votes for, that's the president of the United States. And you also, in these days, kind of don't think about your citizenship to your state as much as you do to the country. But that was so important to our founding and to our success as a nation, and our federal system is key. And I think that is shown also in the Electoral College, although they're not the same exact thing, but I think it is shown in that. Could you kind of just talk about, you said it in your opening piece, but maybe say again the relationship between us as citizens of our states and how the citizens of each state elect our president.
Yeah.
Not that the whole country elects one president.
Very good question. We actually have 50 republics, don't we? We in Federalist 51, Madison says he was so pleased with the Constitution. He said we have a compound republic, and what he meant by that was that not only are we going to have in this Constitution the 3 branches of government, a compound republic in our federal capital, which is the Congress, the judicial branch, and the executive branch. But the Constitution has a guarantee clause that says every state government will have a Republican form of government, small r, or you can't get admitted to the Union. Matter of fact, when Arizona applied to be admitted to the Union, the Congress rejected their Constitution. the Congress thought it wasn't Republican enough, in the sense there weren't enough checks and balances. So Republican government, very different than Democratic government, is a government that has checks and balances to curb tyranny. Now, on the question of states, it's a good question. Most citizens in the 18th century, 19th century, especially the 18th century, never left their state ever, ever, ever. And therefore, their states were their life. That's how life was. My grandfather had, he came from Switzerland to Michigan, and he had two sons, and one son came to Central Illinois, Morton, Illinois, to work on his cousin's farm. And he met Minnie Rapp, who was my grandmother. And he asked Minnie's father after a while if he could marry her, to which he said, "You can if you don't take her to Michigan, because if you take her to Michigan, we will never see her again." So that was about 1900. And the point is that people, if they left their state to marry somebody, they would never, maybe come back on a train once in a while. So the states' rights, which is what the Civil War was about, in a way, about slavery and state determination of things, was always very important. But it is important for us today, because whether you live in Illinois with Springfield, with the capital, or I live now in Virginia, Richmond, Virginia, we have 50 capitals. Each one has a House, a Senate, a governor, a Supreme Court, and all of these things make us a republic. So we do live in republics. The other thing is that Ronald Reagan said in his inaugural address, remember that the states created the federal government didn't create the states. And so we are a nation of states. It's called the United States of America for a reason. There's 13 stars, well, 50 stars now. There were 13 originally, and 13 stripes, I believe, for the original states. So good question. Thank you.
Yeah, and then maybe just even go a little bit more. Thank you for your great answer. Can we illustrate a little bit of how would it look if if a very populated city like New York City or Los Angeles County would functionally be able to choose the president for virtually the entire Midwest and many other, and even within my state of Pennsylvania, there are certain cities where, if you look at a map, these cities have more population than the entire center of my state. So in the founder's idea of government, why would that not be? I mean, to us, we have a million reasons of why we would be able to say right off the top of our head why that's not good. But in trying to keep it a bit rooted in the founder's ideas, why would that not be what was desired? Why don't we want popular rule in that way?
One of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention from Delaware is named Gunning Bedford, Gunningbedford. He made his initial speech on the floor of the Constitutional Convention by beginning with these words: "Gentlemen, I do not trust you. You say that the large states will be in combination, not against us, but against each other. These are words meant to amuse us. The large states will combine against the smaller states." And this was his signal to say little Delaware was not going to have a combination of the large cities or large states. So there was a lot of state loyalty and a lot of jealousy about nationalism, if you will, in America. We didn't have countries in those days. We had kingdoms. We had Philip was the king of Spain, and Louis XVI, the king of France, and George III, of course, and Catherine the Great was the queen of Russia. There were no elections on the planet. When I first gave a speech 5 years ago or 6 years ago at Bradley University in Peoria, Angie, at the end of my speech, I used to start in Philadelphia, right behind us here. I would start in Philadelphia, and a young lady got up and she said, "What I don't like about the founding fathers, they didn't give women the right to vote." And all of her fellow students nodded, "Yes, that's terrible. They didn't give women the right to vote." And I said, now in 1776, Susan, women were voting precisely what countries around the world? I'll wait for your answer. And all the students laughed because they had no idea. And the answer was women had never voted in the history of the planet until this country came along. And so our founders grew up in a time when there were tyranny everywhere, slavery everywhere, poverty everywhere, and freedom pretty much nowhere. So when they did free themselves from the British, the last thing a lot of people wanted in America was a national government that would create a king, a president that would become a king, and we'll be right back in the soup with a dictator again. And by the way, the reason I'm getting off topic a little bit, but Alexis de Tocqueville came to America in 1835 to write his wonderful book, Democracy in America. If you want to understand anything about America, read that book, written by a Frenchman. It was published in 1840 and 1845, 2 volumes, 750 pages. He came to America because his grandfather had seen the French Revolution. And then his father and grandfather had seen the rise of Napoleon from 1801 to 1815. And then by the time Tocqueville's a young man, they're back to the Bourbon Kings. And Tocqueville looks across the Atlantic and says, why is it that the Americans got rid of George III and now they're still electing presidents every 4 years, and these presidents haven't become kings? And yet in my family's history, we've gone from Louis XVI to a parliament with a constitution, to Napoleon, who is just this dictator, and then I think it was King Charles. I'm trying to remember the king when he came over here, but he came over here to tell the Frenchmen how it is that we got rid of a king and we kept our freedom. I think the founders today would be stunned that our Constitution is still alive, because the history of the world was that democracies always failed. This is why Montesquieu wrote Spare the Laws in 1748, which the founders all read and quoted from, because Montesquieu had studied why democracies fail. And his solution was the checks and balances, the House against the Senate, the Congress against the president, the courts against both of them. The only reason we're free is because of checks and balances. And this is what they did. And in terms of electing the president, they wanted to have all the states vote and then aggregate those rather than have a national popular vote, getting back to your question. 9 of our states today in America have 50% of our people. Los Angeles County has more people than 41 of our states. And New York City has more people than 39 states. New York City has the population of all of Virginia. And so if we had a national popular vote, 7, 8 cities would decide everything in this country, and all the people that fed them would be serfs. And people in Iowa will not be serfs. That's why we have our first primary in Iowa. Make sure they're not serfs.
Thank you very much. And I'll pass on to the next. Appreciate the great answer.
Long answer, sorry.
Thank you so much, Michael. We're going to go to Janine next.
Okay.
Hi, and thank you, Michael, for this. And thank you. This is Janine Turner, I always like to say, for our radio show that listens. Michael, we thank you so much for being our guest today. Okay, so we have a lot of youth, homeschoolers and schools and students all the way from elementary, junior high, middle, high school. And so I want to go back and break it all down, and hear what you have to say as the expert, as a subject. You just got to the core of what I think everyone needs to understand when there's this movement to get away from the Electoral College and to just go to popular vote.
Right.
People don't understand, and I like to equate this to the Connecticut Compromise. That everybody needed to be represented with the Senate having 2,
Right.
instead of the House, which was proportional, which would be like the city of Los Angeles choosing who the president is.
Right.
Or so. But I just want to go back and break it down. First of all, it does talk about the Electoral College in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3. And it talks about the electors, where they should meet, and how they should vote. Can you one more time, very, very quickly, because other people need, I don't want to hog a bunch of time, go back and just tell us again so that our students really gather this in the context of that this is in the Constitution about the Electoral College.
Yeah, right.
It was decided when and where, how the electorals, which are people, like, the representatives would be picked. When did they decide that? Was it when they were in their first Congress?
So they left each legislature to decide how to choose their electors. So in Virginia today, we have 2 senators and we have 11 US House members. So we have 13 electors. So in effect, the Electoral College is the recreation of the seats in Congress, House and Senate, but they convene not in Washington, but in their capitals, the same time, the same day, 4 weeks after the election. So 4 weeks from now, they'll meet in my case, in Richmond, and in other cases, in their state capitals. And they will vote the same time. And then as soon as the electors vote, they're no longer public officials and they dissipate. So we, in effect, create a Congress just for electing the president, but nobody that's an elector can be a member of Congress. They didn't want to have deals.
But sorry to interrupt, but don't 2 representatives then go to the Senate in Washington, D.C., where they open everything up? Who opens it up in Washington, D.C.?
Very good. So I'll go through good question. So
okay,
there's 3, there are triangles of freedom in our republic. The Congress, the presidency, and the courts. There's triangles for freedom in the election of president. Here's how it works. We vote in our states. That's the first point. Second point is the electors go to the state capitals 4 weeks later, and they vote the will of their population. And then 4 weeks after that, the day after the Congress is sworn in, the new Congress, then they open the ballots from those 50 ballot boxes in the state capitals, right? Remember,
who is they? Who is they? When you say they open the ballots,
the U.S. Congress. Remember, this is the vice president presides over the certification of the president.
I'm sorry, I talked over you. Who opens it in Washington, D.C.?
Oh, the members of Congress. Well, their clerk opens these state by state, and they're read out. Virginia votes 13 electors for Mr. Trump or Mrs. Harris, whoever it is, and then they go on, and under the electoral.
Okay, so the electoral. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sense of it for the kids. So the electors that are picked in the state meet after the general election.
Yeah.
And open up the ballot. Now these days they just verify it. And that would be proportional, like the House of Representatives, the amount of people that they have, as well as 2, is what I'm understanding.
Yeah. So
okay, and then they say, okay, the president is such and such, and then the representative that's the actual representative, and the senator, I guess, in Washington, D.C., they are the ones that are in the Congress when they open it up, because it says in the Constitution they have to go. It has to be done, opened up a certain way in the D.C. Capitol. Those people are the actual representatives, like your senator, your representative, not the electoral representative.
That's right. So I'll use a personal example. In Virginia, we have 11 congressional districts. And so last May, every political party in Virginia had a convention in their congressional districts. So I'm the 8th congressional district. So we had a convention in early May, and I was a candidate for presidential elector as well as another person. And I happened to be elected by my party, but we have the Green Party, Independent Party, Libertarian Party, we have the Democrat and Republican. We have 4 parties in Virginia. All 4 of those parties choose 13 electors. Usually they choose 11, 1 per congressional district, and then 2 statewide at their statewide convention. So we actually have in Virginia 4 sets of electors ready to vote in Richmond, depending on who wins the vote in Virginia. And so if Mrs. Harris wins today in Virginia, the 13 Democrat electors in 4 weeks will go to the state capitol in Richmond and cast their ballots. At the same day, the same time, that's happening in 49 other state capitals. And the reason the founders wanted to do it that way is so the electors would never meet together, 538 electors, and have a cabal, have a influence by foreigners or have somebody pay them off, because you can't really cheat if you have 50 different elections at the same time. People don't have enough horsepower to ride around the country and get to all those places at the same time. So anyway, that's how they did it. And then 4 weeks after that, those ballots, which are sealed, go and they're opened in the floor of the Senate, and the vice president oversees the opening of that. And 4 years ago, what we had, and of course people talk about what happened January 6th of 4 years ago, was there were objections to some of the ballots being counted in states where there had been voter irregularities. And we don't need to, on this call, talk about we had a lot of irregularities in 2020 election coming out of COVID, unfortunately. Lots of
okay, so just so I clarify one last time, then I want to move on. Thank you, because you're just making it so clear. They open up, they deal with it within their own states. When you say it's 13, that's based off your counties. Therefore,
no, there's 11 congressional districts in Virginia based on population, and we have 2 senators based on the fact we're a state. So we have 13 electors in Virginia.
I was like, so it's counties, congressional districts, not counties. So based off the 13, and each state would have a different number, but based off the 13 congressional districts, all parties get to be represented by 4 people, and then everybody meets at your state capitol and verifies the election. And then none of those electors in the state go to DC for the big opening in front of the vice president. Just yes or no?
The last part is correct, but just so we're clear, in Virginia, we have 4 parties, each have their own sets of electors, but none of them go to Richmond until we have an election result. And then only one set of 13 people drive down to Richmond to vote 4 weeks from now, depending on who wins this state's votes, the Republican, Democrat, Green Party, or Libertarian. And so there's 4 sets of electors, but only one actually casts their votes. Then those are sealed. Those are delivered to the Secretary of the Senate. And then 4 weeks.
They're delivered to the Secretary of State Senate, or they're delivered to the Secretary. Okay, US. So who delivers those? That's what I'm trying to ask. Who delivers that sealed envelope?
The Secretary of State, typically the Secretary of State. Different states may do it differently. It may be the Lieutenant Governor or something. I'd have to look into it, but I think it's typically the Secretary of State delivers those. But it's it's very. And
then it's the United States representatives and the Senate. They're all in the Congress. They're all meeting, and that's when they open it all. Okay, I think I understand this now. And just so our listeners understand, each state is going to do it differently. We're talking right now about how Virginia does it, but the bottom line is there are different congressional districts. There are representatives from those districts that are called electors. And after the election is concluded, they meet, open it up, and verify who their state chooses to be president. Then someone hand delivers it from the state legislatures to the United States legislature, and that this Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 and 3 go to great detail about how they open it up in Washington, D.C. So I think we understand that now, and each state's going to do it a little bit differently, but the core is the same. But before I let you go, and this is lengthy, but I think it's real important that there's just always such confusion because there's so many variables. But the one point that I think needs to be made today is if the reason the Electoral College should not be abolished is because if it were, the state of Wyoming, the smaller states, which is the same problem they had when they were writing the Constitution with the Congressional Connecticut Compromise, if it became popular vote, then Wyoming wouldn't be represented fairly, or New Jersey, maybe New Jersey, Wyoming or Idaho. The smaller states would be overrun by big populated cities if we just went by popular vote. And just like we have 2 representatives from the Senate, it's very important that we have electors that can balance out. The Electoral College balances it out so that each state has a certain amount of electoral votes. That's why today everyone's going to see, I don't know how many California has, 20, let's just say, and Wyoming's going to have 12, but it levels the playing field so that certain states, like if we didn't have the Electoral College, California, Texas, Florida, and New York would choose every president. So could you just, that's the last question I have. Could you just go into that a little bit about why that's so important when this misconception goes flying around the United States that the Electoral College should go away?
Yeah, I think Wyoming has 3 electors because they have 1 House member, and I think California has, I believe, 54 electors. So the big states
Yeah,
still
I was
have a
just
lot.
guessing. I have no clue, which is why I need to learn from you too.
Yeah. So here's the way I discuss it in one of the speeches I give. I show a picture of Central Park in New York City, in Manhattan. And I ask my audiences how many acres in Central Park, and nobody knows, but it's 843. So it's a big piece of property. And I ask how many of those acres are farmed, and everyone laughs. Oh no, they walk their dogs there, they jog there, they have picnics. It's Central Park. We don't farm. We wouldn't have pigs and cows and corn and beans. We don't do that. And then I show a picture of a Whole Foods down on Madison Avenue, and it's full of produce. And I say, gee, these New Yorkers, they have all this produce, but they don't farm their own land. And then I show a picture of an Iowa farm. And I say, this is why we begin our election primaries for president in Iowa, because they feed the cities. It takes 5 acres to feed 1 New Yorker. And if you farmed Central Park, you could feed 136 people a year, not 9 million. So the farms actually feed the cities. And if the cities become tyrannical against rural areas, like where Angie lives and where I grew up, people would be serfs. They would be feeding the cities. I show then a picture of an iron ore mine in Minnesota, in northern Minnesota, which is the largest iron ore mine in the world. And then I show, other than one in China, and then I show a picture of a Caterpillar tractor factory assembly line, where when I got out of graduate school, my first job at Caterpillar, I was a foreman in a factory. And all of our parts were made out of iron for that tractor, sometimes aluminum. But we didn't have iron ores in downtown Peoria where we were building those tractors. The iron ore came from someplace that didn't have very many people at all. And Ford Motor Company's oldest manufacturing plant is in the suburbs of Chicago, Illinois. And they don't grow iron in Chicago, or rubber for the tires. So our states give different value to us as a nation. Some states feed us, others provide natural resources or oil and natural gas. The first oil well in the world was discovered in Pennsylvania. That's why it's called Pennzoil. And so we have about 4 or 5 states like North Dakota and Texas, Oklahoma, have most of our oil and natural gas. Well, I filled up my car today, but we have none of that here in Virginia. So we depend on each state, and we don't want to have just the cities who get all their food and all their natural resources from other states rule those people on which they depend for their food and their resources. So it's a wonderful way to have everyone recognized for the value they bring to this union.
That's great. I was thinking about that same analogy earlier about a farm. In order to farm the food, you can't have 1 million people living, on 800 acres or whatever, like Manhattan. So that's no, Manhattan's bigger than 800 acres. We're just talking about Central Park. Great analogy. Great analogy. Last question. I lied. I said the last one was my last one, but I have to ask this, and you could answer this in like 10 seconds. Are the electors secret? Were they ever secret? Weren't their names supposed to be secret? Are they still in certain states, in all states? Because they didn't want the electors to be like you talked about, they didn't want them to be pressured to do something. So they
historically, until the middle of the 20th century, the names of the presidential candidates were very often not on the ballot. The names of the electors were listed on the ballot by party, and you actually voted for the electors. We don't do that anymore. Now we put Trump and Harris and all the rest. But we used to actually list the electors, but they've never been secret. It's matter of public record. It always has been. Electors have never been secret in our lifetime.
That's wild. I could swear someone told me somewhere that they had to be secret at a certain point in this country because they didn't want to be pressured. I don't know where I heard that, but I heard that somewhere.
No, I think what they probably had in mind was because they convene in the state capitol, which is guarded. Okay, so in other words, they don't have crowds surrounding them. They're convening in a guarded state capitol on the same day at the same time in 50 capitals. They are secret in that it's a secret ballot they're casting. And then it's aggregated and it's sent to Washington. But no, everybody, I mean, I had over 500 votes in my congressional district when I was elected as an elector, because I had to give a speech to about 700 people. And so all 700 know who I am and they know who they elected. And when they went home, they probably said, that guy got elected again, whatever. Or maybe they were happy, maybe they weren't. But it's very public. Everybody in my party and all the parties, they all know who the electors are because they elect them in open conventions. Anybody
Great. Okay, good to know. I'm going to pass on so everybody has a chance to talk. I'm sorry I took up so much time today. I just wanted the youngsters to be able to understand. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, Angie.
Well, thanks, Janine. I appreciate you really digging in because it helped me understand a lot better too. I'm such a visual person. I don't know if you guys are. Like, it'd be nice to see that Virginia map and then how it's broken down into like the 11 districts and then +2 because you've got your senators and then kind of just understanding in a visual way. I'm sure those materials are out there too, but I'm so thankful, Michael, that you brought up Iowa. It's actually originally where I'm from, and we're still farmers here in Illinois, Northern Illinois. And so just protecting those resources are so important, and it definitely hits home because we have it a different way in Illinois. Like you said, Chicago controls a lot of our state. And so I'll give an example of wind and solar projects that are heavily coming into our region where, you know, in our county, about 15,000 acres is going to be taken up by wind and solar.
Yeah.
So that's just one example, I think, of how if you start to do like popular vote, you might tend to just forget, you know, where these important resources come from. So I appreciate you saying that. But I was going to bring up something earlier, like right before the video started. I think we started talking about your background, and you said a news article really got you into politics and interested. What do you think that the popular press might be able to do to really educate the public on these certain principles that you're talking about? For example, you speak about the Federalist Papers a lot. They're a really important part of our history. What do you think the popular press might be able to do to sort of help us come back to this civics conversation?
Yeah, good question. Well, and by the way, since you're looking into these windmills in your county, I'm on the board of the Caesar Rodney Institute in Delaware, which is like the Heritage Foundation of the Delaware state. And they are fighting windmills on the shore, offshore. And so Dave Stevenson, who works at Caesar Rodney, is an expert on this. I can contact him for you or introduce you because that state has a big controversy as well as your county. So your question, help me out. What was your question again?
I was just about the popular press.
Oh, yes. What the, yeah, news media. So on Monday Night Football, people tune in because there's two teams and they compete. People like competition. And in the courtroom, we have the defense and the prosecution. And what we've learned in quote, democratic life is that competition is healthy to keep people free. I think something that USA Today or the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Chicago Tribune or Sun Times or all kinds of newspapers could do would have pro and con op-eds on civic questions. So rather than we at the New York Times are against the Electoral College, why not you get a couple of first-rate scholars and have them do a printed debate? You know, George Will for the Electoral College and Professor Amar, there happens to be a professor named Akil Amar, against the Electoral College, and let people read those 900-word essays and get more insights into the arguments. So in other words, newspapers could use their forum for competition of ideas rather than monopoly of ideas. The Washington Post and New York Times just announced, and USA Today, they're not going to endorse for president because so many people already see them as sort of on one side. I think newspapers want to rehabilitate, and frankly, the news media rehabilitate their reputations. They could create more competitive dialogues rather than always telling us one side, no matter what side they happen to favor. So I think competition is very healthy in elections, in courtrooms, in sports, and it would be in political civic education.
Thank you for sharing that. That definitely makes sense in my mind that, you know, you'd go back to this sort of forum that was really popular during the founding of our country, where people got to write this long section and basically have this open essay that's like, this is why this is such a good idea. And then going into my next question, this will probably be my last question, is what do you think the reason is that this Constitution, this Republic has really survived for so long? For example, I tend to think that it survived for so long because of it's based on divine principles. You know, in Romans 13 in the Bible, it talks about how we should be able to serve God and also have our civil government. And I think our founding fathers understood this concept and perhaps had divine revelation about how to structure these things. What are your thoughts on that? And what do you think about the specific reason why it has survived so long?
Yeah, great question. And I think you've hit on it. The number 4 author or thinker that the founders quoted was John Locke, which is where we get Jefferson's idea of natural law. We're endowed by our creator with our rights. The number 3 was Blackstone. Blackstone's commentaries on the law, and the founders were lawyers, many of them, and so they read his commentaries on the law. Number 2 was Montesquieu, Spirit of the Laws, 1748, which was Mr. Checks and Balances. And number 1 was the Bible. And all those other quotes combined were half of what the quotes of the founders from the Bible. The founders have a written constitution because of the 10 Commandments. They read Jeremiah, I think it's 16:9 or 17:9. I think it's 16:9. But man has an evil heart. But that's also talked about in Genesis. You know, in the story of Adam and Eve, really. But the thing that I like the most is Isaiah 33:22. God is the king, the lawgiver, and the judge. In Isaiah, that's 400 years before Aristotle came up with the checks and balances, which the Roman Empire, Roman Republic used. 400 years before Aristotle, the Old Testament had the three branches in Isaiah 33:22. This is why we're free. We're free because if the House passes something, the Senate can stop it, or vice versa. If the Congress does something, the president can veto it, or he can sign it. If he vetoes it, they can override it. And then the courts can say you're both wrong, and on and on and on. And what people call gridlock is what keeps us free, which is that if the House and Senate can't agree on something, well, then just don't do anything. You know, if you don't have something good to say, don't say anything at all. Well, if you don't have something good to do, don't do anything at all. So that's why we're free, the checks and balances. And the other thing that's going to happen in the next 3 days is somebody's going to be very unhappy about who the next president is. And half the country will be. And we're going to hear all kinds of comments. And some are not very pretty, and we may even have violence. Who knows? But the thing about our three branches of government is almost without fail, it gives the opposition a place to go to fight again. So, for example, the Senate and the White House right now are controlled by one party, but the House by another party. And is what we call divided government. In most of our history, we have divided government. So if, for example, Mr. Trump is elected tonight or tomorrow, and the other party is very unhappy, but they're probably going to control either the House or the Senate, and so they can stop things, or they can not fund things, or they can, not approve a court appointees or that sort of thing. So by having the triangles of freedom, the checks and balances between the three branches, we have the ingredients of everybody having enough of a power base, if you will, in modern terms, to fight again, to compete again. And it gives people hope for the next election. And that's why the Constitution guarantees a Republican government in Springfield. Unfortunately, one party controls so much of your government that you have a lot of dysfunction, and we find this. And this is really because of Baker versus Carr, where the Supreme Court said one man, one vote. We used to have in Illinois, every county had one senator. And there's 102 counties in Illinois. And so we had 102 senators, but some represented just farms in some big cities. But that way, all parts of the state had a voice because of the state Senate. But when the Warren Court, which also had other terrible decisions, in my humble opinion, when they came up with the one man, one vote, they destroyed all the checks and balances of the state legislatures. And therefore, you don't have those checks and balances in California, Illinois, Texas, et cetera. What we really want is divided power to keep us free. What we don't want is united power to control our lives. And I think the founders would say that the checks and balances are so important.
Well, thank you, Angie. Those were great questions, and Janine and Jewel, and thank you, Michael. And we're going to work in some audience questions here before the end of the hour. But first, we want to recognize our students and teachers who are watching today. We have Hope Mucklow with a homeschool student watching. We have Ursula Adams Verna Montessori School with 8 students watching. We have D'Angela Hines, Emerald Coast Christian Academy has students watching. We have Sharon Cray with the Constitution's Basics class for adults that has somewhere between 10 and 50 students watching, she said. So we thank all the 2 students and teachers who are joining us today. We also want to thank Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM on the radio dial. KKVV airs these Constituting America's live Constitutional Chats podcasts on Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific. So thank you to our listeners, Constituting America's Chats listeners in Las Vegas. So Michael, Judy wrote in, just texted me a question a minute ago asking, is it more the exception or the rule that the popular vote and the electoral vote have not agreed
It's a very good and timely question. In the 19th century, we had 3 times where the popular vote did not coincide with the Electoral College in this sense. 1824, Jackson had the most votes, but no one won in the Electoral College. The only time that's happened in our history. And so it went into the House of Representatives, and the House Well, Henry Clay, there were 4 candidates, that's why. And Henry Clay threw in with John Quincy Adams, and the US House elected John Quincy Adams, even though he had fewer votes than Jackson. And then Jackson came back 4 years later and had two presidencies, 2 terms. But in 1876 and in 1888, we had people elected for president that didn't win the Electoral College. In the case of 1876, we had federal troops in 3 southern states, in Louisiana, North Carolina, and Georgia. And because of that, the federal troops were running the elections. It was very violent. There was a lot of dissent about not allowing blacks to vote, which they'd gotten the vote because of the Civil War. And therefore, the US Congress actually chose the president through a commission. And then in 1888, it simply was that the winner got a 200,000 fewer votes. So it was very close. But we had, in the 20th century, everybody that won for president also won the popular vote. The only possible exception is John F. Kennedy in 1960 was very close with Nixon, very close. And because Mayor Daley was running Chicago, Mayor Daley the first, there was a lot of thought that there was a lot of corruption to have the first Catholic president elected by Illinois, but Nixon refused to have a recount in Illinois because he didn't want to disrupt the Union. In this century, though, we had in 2000 Bush v. Gore. Gore got 250,000 more votes than Bush, even though Bush, by the way, 30 states, Gore 20. And then we had Trump versus Clinton, where she had 2.5 million more votes than he did, all from California. But he won 30 states and she won 20. If today Mr. Trump, let's say, would win the presidency but lose the popular vote, that'd be the 3rd time this century. And we will see a lot more demands to change the Electoral College because people are been convinced that, you know, the majority should always rule, even though we have 50 majority votes and then those votes are aggregated. But the popular mind has been told we're a democracy, not a republic, and so it's a complicated thought.
Well, thank you, Michael. And then we have several audience members, including my dad, Don Hay, that have asked this question, wondering if my dad says each party has a set of electors. Are the electors legally bound to that party?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Actually, are they legally bound to do what the voters of that state say? We have 17 states that specifically say the elector must follow the popular vote. And there are other states that have more of a nuanced record on this. Some states can remove an elector if they don't behave themselves, or they can fine them. But it's very rare. We've only had several people not live up to their job. And the reason is what I said earlier, which is I was elected by 500 and some members of my party to be an elector, and I know them. As a matter of fact, I called all of them before the convention. I called 500 or 600 people, and they all said one thing on the phone to me: will you vote with our state if so-and-so wins, our candidate wins? And I said, yes, I gave my word. What do you think my life would be like if I went back on my word to all those people that I know? And I would be hated and distrusted and outcast from my community, my political community anyway, my political party. So, and plus people know me. I've been here for 30 years in this city, and they know that I'm not going to do that. So electors are people that are elected by others that really know they're of good character, I think, anyway. Maybe that's immodest, but I think that I would, that it's rare. Nobody's ever changed an election because they've been, we call them unfaithful electors. We've had 7 or 8 or 9 or something, but they'll vote for Eisenhower when he's dead. You know, they'll make a point because they know their vote won't count because it's already decided. But it's a really, and Colorado actually removes an elector who publicly said he was not going to vote for the candidate, and so they removed him from and the Supreme Court upheld that removal. Yeah.
Well, thank you. This has been a fascinating hour. We could go on for forever, but we're a little bit past 3. And so we just want to thank you so much for being with us, Michael, tonight. As we watch the election returns tonight and hear about the Electoral College, we'll have a much better understanding thanks to you.
Yeah.
So,
Can I just say one thing? I do give speeches around the country on this for no cost. So if people want to arrange a speech, they can contact me.
well, thank you so much. And we want to thank our audience today and all of your great questions. And thank you, Angie, for joining us, and Jewel and Janine and Jorn. And does anybody have any parting words real quick before we go?
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a
Thank y'all.
wonderful show and great day for it. And nice to meet you and have you on the show, Angie.
You as well.
Congratulations. Thank you, Angie. Okay. Thank y'all. Bye.
Doctor.